Hi, I'm Amy, and welcome to a chronological study of the life of Jesus. Join me as we study the Gospels in order using John MacArthur's book, One Perfect Life. Welcome to Lesson 27. In Lesson 26, we were talking about the first few disciples that met Jesus and followed him and kind of what their interactions were and what they called him and what his names mean. So in this one, this is Lesson 27. This is Jesus' first miracle, water into wine. So this is where he's really beginning to show his glory, as it says, to kind of reveal who he is and show others that, I don't want to say what he can do, but show others who he is and the power that he has. So this is his first recorded miracle. And after this lesson, it'll jump into the next segment, which is going to be the first full year of his ministry. It's kind of how this book breaks it down. So this is the last lesson before we jump into that first full year of his true ministry. So this is his first miracle, water into wine. And it's very popular. I think a lot of people know this story, or at least know that Jesus turned water into wine. We're going to read it out of John chapter 2. And then I've got 5 points to talk about. So let's read first. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now, both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. And when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." Now there were set there 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Draw some out now and take it to the master of the feast." And they took it. When the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom. And he said to him, "Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now." This beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum, he, his mother, his brothers, and his disciples. And they did not stay there many days. The first point I'd like to bring out is the timing of these events, okay? So it's a series of events that happen on 7 consecutive days. And this is something that John has been pointing out in his book. Why did John point out that it was this day, and then on the next day, and then on the third day, and that sort of thing? Why did John choose to point out that all these things were happening one event after the other, kind of like a timeline? And really the best I can say is that it just shows in the action, the series of what was going on that week, and in that 7-day time span in Jesus' early ministry. It shows the action taking place, and it shows that there's a real timeline of events occurring. As John's writing this down, he's writing in the 90s AD. So he's writing his gospel decades after the other Gospels have come out. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have already been circulating and popular for a few decades. And then John writes his. The first 3 are known as the Synoptic Gospels. So they are very in sync with each other, and they very much are similar in the way that they're written. And then John comes along at the end. He's not part of that. His is very different in the way that it is written. It is because of John's gospel that we see that there were exactly 3 years of ministry, because he records 3 different Passovers. And so his is just written in a whole different thing. He wrote his to show that Jesus was God. He wrote his much later and included a lot of things that they didn't include. So here he's showing, as I'm writing it down, I know that this happened after this, happens after this, happened after this. And all of it led up to this wedding and what was going on here, because I was there, because I saw it, because I knew. So this series of events that's happening on these consecutive days, if we go back the days, so the first day of this series is when John the Baptist is testifying to the Levites. And he's telling them who he is. Are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah? Are you the prophet? Are you Elijah? And he says, no, no, no. And he's telling them who the Christ is. That's day 1. Day 2 is when he calls him the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. That's day 2. Day 3 then is John the Baptist's testimony to the disciples that, who he is. Day 4, and that's when, day 3 is when the disciples get called and Andrew goes and meets with Jesus. That's day 3. Day 4 is when Jesus decides he wants to go up towards Galilee because he's got to get back up to that wedding. So he's been down here where they're baptizing, and John's been speaking, and then the disciples meet Jesus. And he wants to go to Galilee. So day 4, he travels up to Galilee, meets Philip and Nathaniel and all that. So that's day 4. And then day 5 and 6 are travel days because he's getting up to Cana. And then on day 7, which here it says on the 3rd day of this series, from the time that he had called the disciples or told them to follow him, that the disciples had met him, then he goes to this wedding. So interestingly enough, it says on the 3rd day because that was the 3rd day after John had met Jesus. Because remember we said that Andrew and another disciple of John the Baptist met Jesus, and we believe that the other disciple was John the Apostle. That could get really confusing, but I'm talking about the Apostle John that wrote the book. And then they were disciples of John the Baptist, him and Andrew. And it's believed that it was him, John the Apostle, because he knew the exact time. And he's writing this book and he's got the details. So that day in his mind was day 1 when I met Jesus, day 2 when we traveled. And then on the 3rd day, there was this wedding in Cana. So he's traveling, right? So 3 days from the time that they met him. So I'm sorry, that would be day 1 would be the day that he met him, and then 1, 2, 3, and on the 3rd day from there. That's what it's saying. 3 days from the day they met him. And so it's a 7-day time span of all that's going on in his life. And so John is recording, well, I met Jesus, and then 3 days after that, we're at this wedding together. And so it's just showing that this was a real timeline that a real person wrote. Now, a wedding is a very interesting thing. I did a lot of research on weddings for Jewish culture, and a wedding can last for up to 7 days, up to a week. We're not going to really talk about any specific wedding incidences in this lesson. The lesson's not really about the wedding, it's about the miracle. But I'd like to tell you a little bit about a Jewish wedding because I found out a couple things that I find so fascinating. And I was reading a book, like a Jewish customs book, and it was talking about the wedding and how they were betrothed. And we talked about that when we talked about Mary and Joseph, that the betrothal period was usually a year, and it was for the, bridegroom, the groom, to get the place ready, usually his home or his father's home. He would be preparing for his new wife, and then she would be preparing her wedding dress, and it was a time of purity. It was a time of waiting, but it was a legal binding time that would require a divorce if they were to separate during the engagement period. Well, then comes the wedding, and the wedding was very a big ordeal, and she would wear, it's interesting if you ever look it up, you could do a quick Google search and see kind of an ancient Jewish headdress that they would wear. And interestingly, it was ornate, it was decorated, and she would wear this headdress that had coins it's kind of sewn in there, and that was part of her dowry, some coins, and she would sew them into the headdress and as part of it. And that could be potentially in the parable that Jesus tells of the woman with the lost coin. She loses those silver coins and she's looking for them. It likened those coins off of that headdress, that if she were to lose one of those, that was very valuable to her. And so I thought that was interesting that they made that connection with the wedding. The second connection that it makes is that there's a procession from the groom's house to get the bride, or from the bride coming to the groom's home, wherever they're bringing them back kind of for the ceremony. There's a procession through the streets, and the streets were dark. They didn't have electricity, so it was lit by oil lamps and lights like that. And the parable of the 10 virgins, or whatever it is, I think it's what it's called, where Jesus is telling about the 10. There was some that were not prepared when the bridegroom got back. Their oil lamps had burned out and they didn't bring more oil, so their lamps weren't lit, versus the ones that were prepared had their lamps lit. And that is a reference to the wedding procession, and how they would bring them in and they would welcome in the bridegroom and the bride and for the celebration. And they would light lamps, and that's what would guide the party, because it was dark. And so in this one, as the bridegroom was coming in the parable, you had some that were not prepared and some that were, and the ones that were able to welcome him and his bride in. You know, we talk about Jesus being the groom and the church being the bride of Christ, and how the preparation and the ones that are ready to welcome the groom in, and those that aren't prepared, you know, by foolishness, are not ready to welcome Jesus. And so that was another thing I found interesting. And the third piece I think I found the most interesting is that the bride would wear a veil, and it would come off at some point during the either the meeting of the groom or sometime during the celebration. But you have to throw out everything you know about Western weddings, because that's not what was pictured, you know, in their heads here. But at some point he would flip back her veil, or he would remove her veil, and it would be laid on the groom's shoulder, and it would say, the government shall rest upon your shoulder. And if you have heard any kind of Christmas sermon, that should remind you of Isaiah, I think chapter 9, where it says, unto us a son is born, unto us a child is given, or child is given, a son is born, and the government shall rest upon his shoulders. And that's the same line, that's the same reference there to this idea of he takes her veil off, his bride, and he lays it on his shoulder for keeping, and she now belongs to him, and the transference of her protection and her provision for her is now his responsibility. So in that wedding, it's not necessarily that he is going to be in government or political power. It is this governing of her, this protection, this providing for her. This authority is now onto him, and this responsibility is now laid upon his shoulder to protect his bride, to take care of his bride, to be there for his bride. And then when you relay it to the fact that Jesus is the groom, and the government is resting on his shoulders, in that he has authority over us. He is there to protect and provide for us. I don't know, I just think it's a beautiful correlation there. And I never heard those two things connected until I did a little research on Jewish weddings, because of this particular thing. And I just found that very interesting, that there's a lot that went into a wedding, and it could be up to a 7-day event at some point. And they had other, you know, things that I won't go into, but very interesting, worthwhile study to just look it up and find out some information about it. But basically, very interesting, some things I learned. So that was a freebie, that was not part of it, but that was just about weddings. Now the second thing is we're going to talk about who was at this wedding. So the attendants that were present, we have Jesus, we have Mary, we have his siblings, because it mentions that his siblings are leaving. We have some disciples. So it says his disciples were invited. So it wasn't as if Jesus came and then brought this whole entourage. It specifically says that the mother of Jesus and everything, and then these disciples were invited. So you have to understand that you've got a wedding in Cana, which is about 9 miles from Nazareth. It's real close to the Sea of Galilee, near Bethsaida, near all these places. So Jesus was invited, Peter and Andrew, James and John probably, maybe Philip, Nathaniel. Nathaniel's from Cana. So they're all invited to this wedding. So they all ran in the same circles, or they knew the same people. Maybe some were related to this couple getting married somehow. But it's interesting that it's not random that these people are there. Jesus, the disciples, Mary, they're all invited. This was a small area. This was a community of sorts, and they're all going to this wedding. They're all invited. So we have, the bridegroom. We said the disciples. So assuming it's John, because it has to be, he seems to know all these details about it, right? Andrew, Peter, Philip, Nathaniel, and then you've got this bridegroom. We don't know who he is, but he's familiar, or his wife's family is familiar with Jesus, his family, and the disciples' family. Then you've got this master of the feast, and I looked that up, and a master of the feast was somebody that either could be hired as a servant or somebody that was put in charge of this. And it was just someone that was like a wedding coordinator in a way, what we would think of. It was someone that would watch the catering, someone that would watch the wine, someone that would watch the festivities to make sure everything's going as it should. And they were the ones that would maybe taste the wine before it goes out, and just kind of keep everything going. It was a particular position. And so it mentions that one, and they're all local and to this Cana and Galilee area. They either knew them, they were related, or had relationships of some sort. So what's the point of this, right? Why is John the only gospel writer that includes this, though? Okay, so we have to think about that, and that John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke didn't include it. And like I said, John wrote his later, so he felt the need to go back and put this one in to exhibit something in particular about Christ. In his whole gospel, he's trying to prove that Christ is the Son of God, is who he says he is deity, he is all these things. And he believes this one should be very important, should be in here, and the others didn't include it. So that's why we believe John was present. But why include this? Well, the options are he's present when the others aren't. This kind of initiates Jesus' ministry because it reveals the glory. He does a miracle. And he writes decades later. So others are circulating. They may have said, okay, he didn't include his first miracle. I need to put that one in there, perhaps. And then there's also this. John includes 7 signs. He doesn't call them miracles, just these supernatural acts of power, these miracles. He doesn't just say, 7 miracles. He calls them signs. In particular, he lists 7 signs in his gospel that point to Jesus being Messiah. His whole point of listing them as signs is that they have a deeper meaning than just the miracle. So this one is water into wine. He says this one is a sign of him being the Messiah. And there's 6 others that he gives to prove his deity. And I have a list of those, and we'll get to them as we study them, but very quickly, here are the 7 signs that John mentions in his gospel. 1 is changing water into wine at that wedding. Number 2 is healing the official son in Capernaum. 3 is healing an invalid at the pool at Bethesda in Jerusalem. 4 is feeding 5,000 near the Sea of Galilee. Number 5 is walking on water of Sea of Galilee. 6 is healing a blind man in Jerusalem. And 7 is raising of Lazarus when he was dead in Bethany. And so those are all very different signs, very unique. Circumstances are all different. They're not really correlating to one another. There's a couple of healings. There's the raising of the dead. There's the feeding. There's the transformation of water to wine. So they're all different. But John says these are specifically 7 signs. Every time these are done, he calls them signs. So these are signs that point to Jesus being Messiah. So that's something we need to know about his gospel and something we need to note about that. Now, this just shows to me this attendance and that he's at a wedding is that Jesus is human. Jesus has familial relationships and friendly relationships, and he's human. He's got to be at a wedding. His mom's there, his family's there, he's been invited, and he shows up. Now, the third thing is that a problem arises at this wedding. So Mary gets concerned that they run out of wine. Why is Mary concerned? Well, what happened is it was the grooms, or the bridegroom is what they call him. It was his job to prepare for this wedding. It was his job to fund this wedding and to prepare for the feast of the people that are invited. And these feasts could last for 7 days sometimes. So it was his job to be prepared and do all of that. Well, if he ran out of supplies, wine, food, for this all the guests that he's inviting, number one, it's embarrassing. Number two, it could show lack of hospitality. And number three, his poor planning and everything could end up leading to a lawsuit from the bride's family for legal reasons that he was unable to provide, or, bad faith kind of thing. So Mary is aware that all of that could happen. And clearly she's at this wedding because she knows this family and she sees the issue. And she doesn't want this problem for this person that she cares about. So she sees the problem and she's aware that Jesus can help. She's, at this point, we don't know if Jesus has ever done any other miracles or done anything that would be supernatural and strange as a child. But Mary, she knew Jesus could do something. And so she turns to him for help. Now, the takeaway here is that Mary saw a problem and she instantly went to Jesus with it. And again, we don't know what the extent of her knowledge was of what his powers were. And I know she did not anticipate this miracle of water, him transforming the water into wine, but she felt that Jesus could do something. And so God should be our first place that we turn to for help. The first place we turn to with our praise, with our prayer, with our worship, with our requests, with our rejoicing. Jesus should be our first stop, and that was kind of her deal. Like, she saw a problem and she instantly thought, Jesus, there's a problem. They're out of wine. And she turned to him and, she said, they have no wine. And so she's turning to him kind of in anticipation that he would help. So the fourth point then is that Jesus is called on by Mary. So she says, they have no wine. And a strange little interaction occurs, or at least I think it can kind of be, you may not think it is, but I think it can kind of be a strange interaction between a mother and son, because he says, woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. So he calls her woman, which I don't think would fly in today's families. I don't think that sounds rude, and we would think that's not right. Don't say that. And then he says, what you're concerned with, what's that got to do with me? And that could also sound kind of rude, but Jesus was being completely polite in this moment. Jesus was not being rude. She calls on him, and then he seems reluctant to manifest himself because his hour has not yet come. And she knew none of that. She didn't know what that meant. She didn't really get that part of it. That wasn't on her radar. And he calls her woman. And so he is distancing himself in a way from her in that moment. It's always been mother of Jesus and Jesus the son of Mary, and they've always kind of gone together. Well, at this point, he calls her woman, which is what everything I read is the equivalent of him saying ma'am, or, miss, or ma'am, or something like that. Something polite, ma'am. And he's not saying mother or mom or anything like that. He's saying, ma'am, what you're concerned about? What are you bringing that to me for? What do you have to do with me? What's your concern? Why is what you're bothered with meant to bother me? And so in a way, in that moment, he is really checking the situation. He is letting her know that there's a distance here. Although I have always been your son and will always be your son, he has a higher purpose in that moment. He is to follow what God says to do. Okay, so by saying that and calling her woman and everything, Jesus is distancing himself from her and letting her know that although she's his mother, his goal is to do what the Father tells him to do. His goal is to be on mission for God, and what God's will be done in Jesus' life. So his hour has not yet come. He seems reluctant to do anything that might be outside of God's will. And I'm not saying that what he did here was outside of the will of God or anything like that, because clearly it wasn't. And Jesus is perfect and he's obedient. But I think he's just letting her know that his will is to do the will of the Father. So I can't just do anything you ask because you're my mother. I have to do what God tells me to do. And so regardless, she tells the others to do what he tells them to do. Whatever he says do, that's what you need to do. So she took it well, and she understood that his goal and purpose was higher, and whatever he tells you to do it. So even in that moment, she had faith in Jesus' ability, and she had trust in him. and tells them to be obedient. So she says, okay, no matter what you say, I believe you, and I know that you have the power, and whatever he tells y'all to do, do it. That's how you're going to solve this problem. And so the next thing that happens is that Jesus tells the others what to do, but he doesn't actually touch or handle or physically do anything that is visual. He tells them to fill up the jars, to draw out the water, and then to take it. And so he gives them, fill, draw, and take, 3 things that they should do. And so quickly, this ceremonial washing pots, they were made of stone, and they held 20 to 30 gallons of water each when they were full. And there were 6 of them. So that's somewhere between like 120 and 180 gallons of wine that was made on this day. So that's a lot. He prepared a lot to save the day for this bridegroom, basically. But the ceremonial washing pots were used in the purification. So what the Jews would do is when they came into the home, they would wash their feet, they'd wash their hands ceremonially to show that they were clean. And that was the water set aside for purification, for washing, for making clean. And that was just sitting there. So he had those available. And he tells them to fill them up, draw out some water, and then take it. And so he first tells them, I find it kind of interesting, he tells them to fill up the water pots with water. And the next thing says, and they filled them up to the brim. And then he said, draw it out. And they did that. So I think what's unique about this story is that Jesus doesn't handle or touch or, when we look at other miracles that he does, he'll touch the person or pray over the person, or he made the mud and put it on the guy's eyes to heal the blindness. There's other miracles that he does that you see him actively doing. But in this one, he doesn't really do that. This miracle almost seems like the miracle was of their obedience. And I'm not saying that they made it happen, that they were the miracle or anything like that. I'm just saying the miracle was in their obedience to it, that he did it through their obedience. And so the servants are obedient because Mary tells them to be, and then the miracle occurs. So what is the significance, do you think, that Jesus didn't physically do anything, but that the miracle happened when he told them to fill them up? And then they did. And when he saw that they were filled, he said, now draw it out and take it. What would have happened if they wouldn't have filled them up, if they weren't obedient? Common sense, I suppose, would tell us that maybe the miracle wouldn't have happened, or he would have found another way if he really wanted it to happen or whatever. But the way it took place was that they were obedient, and he worked a miracle in that. So Mary seemed to direct them by telling them to do what he says, and I wonder sometimes if our miracle or our answer that we're looking for, or the sign that we need from God, or whatever it is that you're praying for that breakthrough to happen, if it happens, or it doesn't happen because God is waiting for your action. God is waiting for your obedience to what he's told you to do, or your cooperation in this moment with him, telling you what the next step is. And that I wonder sometimes if we give up before the miracle happens because we're not faithful to follow through what he's told us to do. And sometimes there are moments where he tells us, peace, be still and know that I'm God. Wait for God. And there are those kind of moments. But there's also the fact that he's called us to absolute obedience. That if he has told us what's the move to make, what's the next step, to go fill up the water, don't worry about what happens next. You go fill up the water, and we go fill up the water, then the miracle can happen. And so our steps of obedience can foster that miracle in our lives. And it's not that it falls on our shoulders as miracle workers or anything like that. It's that God uses our obedience to work his miracles, that God sees the faith behind it, that God sees our trust and our faith in him and our moving for him, and that precedes the miracle happening. And so I just wonder sometimes if we need to be obedient and make the move, especially if he's already told us to do it. And that's what can lead to the miracle. But that's just interesting that I thought that, he doesn't actually physically do anything. These servants are going and grabbing and doing, and he's just telling them to do it, and they do it, and then the miracle happens. So what ends up happening is point number 5, the outcome. So the outcome is that they fill up these water pots, and Jesus transforms all of that water, from 120 to 180 gallons of water into wine. And they take it to the master of the feast. He tastes it, and he says something along the lines of, other people bring out the good stuff first and let people taste it and get used to the good stuff, and then they slowly taper off of what's good. And so by the end of the feast, you're drinking, some that's subpar, but you don't realize it because you've had all the good and that sort of thing. Maybe some people are too drunk to realize, or whatever it may be, your dull senses. But he says, no, you've waited till the end to bring out the good. You've brought out the best wine at the very end. And so saving this best for last was the outcome. And then the party is saved, and there's enough wine, and it turns into a wonderful wedding feast. But what was the outcome of that? So what it says after that is this began Jesus' public ministry. This is the beginning of signs that he does. And these signs, like I mentioned, are the ones that prove his deity. So for John, this was a proof that he was God, for him to be able to do this. It manifested his glory. The disciples believed at that point. They saw this. Mary saw this. The servants saw it and knew. And they said, wow, he is the Son of God. He is the Messiah. There is something different. I believe in this guy. And he and his family then would travel to Capernaum, which is near the Sea of Galilee again. And they would stay there only a few days, it says, because what he's really trying to do is get down. After that, he'll go to Jerusalem for a Passover feast. So that's kind of the movement then of Jesus. After Cana, he goes to Capernaum, and then he's going back down to Jerusalem. So let's look at what it means. What does it mean that he manifests his glory? So what is God's glory but his radiance, his beauty, his power, his strength, and all of this? In this moment, Jesus revealed the glory of the Father. He revealed the glory of God to these people. He showed them the truth of who he was. He showed them God's awesome, powerful glory, his worthiness, his holiness in that moment, right? And they believed. So this sign, amongst others, proves Jesus' deity. In these signs and miracles, we see the glory and the power of God displayed, doing what no one else could do. And when we see God's glory, it should erupt in praise and worship on our side. It should spark belief in us. And God has given us Jesus last. And last is what's best. And what I mean by that is that Christianity is better in a way than Judaism. So all of Judaism, they had sacrificial lambs, and they had the law, and they had ways that they were supposed to do and perform. But as John said, the law came first, and then grace came after, grace and truth, right? And Jesus has ushered in this era of grace, this covenant of grace, this time of grace, right? Where it's a new way of being, and it's a new way of existing with God, and that we are forgiven by the blood of Jesus. And so in some ways, Jesus coming in, this miracle of the wine translates into Jesus being that wine, that good wine that comes at the end of the feast. And it's better than what you served at the beginning, that this new way is better than the old way. This new life is better than the old. And so the next thing is the miracle was a transformative miracle. So he's transforming water into wine, showing that Jesus was ushering in a new way, showing that he had this transformative ability, that he had this creative ability. In Luke chapter 5, he talks about putting new wine into new wineskins. So we're doing something new here, Jesus is saying, like this new wine, we're doing something new, a new way and a new miracle. So the final thing is that in the Passover, in the Last Supper, there's wine used, and Jesus represents, he says this wine of this Last Supper represents the blood. And, we do communion or the Lord's Supper or whatever we call it. And when we do that, we have the bread and we have the wine or grape juice or whatever you use. And the liquid, whatever it is, wine, represents the blood of Jesus spilled. And so Jesus equates that Last Supper wine and that Passover wine with his blood that is spilled. So John Calvin noted that in essence, his first miracle was foreshadowing his atoning death. So I think there is some significance to that. I do believe that his first miracle, being changing water into wine, is less of a party trick and saving this wedding, and more of showing, as John said, this sign that he is God, that this wine will become significant because it's my blood and it's my atoning death. He was foreshadowing from the outset of his ministry that he would die and his blood would be spilled and would atone for us. That he's ushering in a new way, a transformation. The old is now becoming new, and he's changing. And I think that's a very wonderful picture of exactly what he does, what Christ does when he comes into our lives. When we accept his atoning death for us, right? His blood covers our sins. And we have new life. We have a new way of being. We are now no longer that water. We are now this rich, profitable wine. We are something that was dead is now made alive in Christ. And so the old is passing away and the new has come. So there's just a lot of metaphors in the Bible for old and new. And I think that's a lot of what this miracle can represent in our lives, is that the old is made new. And so that's really all I've got as far as that goes. The wrap up for it is that Jesus was obedient to God first and foremost over Mary. And that should be an example to us, that first and foremost is God's will be done. Not mine, not yours, not anybody around us, but God's will. And he performed his first miracle and ushered in his ministry with this. And the other thing is that sometimes it's our obedience and what he has called us to do that ushers in the miracle, that ushers in the answer and the change in our life. We have to be obedient to what he's telling us to do sometimes in order for the breakthrough to happen. That some things don't happen from us just sitting back and not moving. Sometimes we have to be proactive and responsive to where God is moving and what he is doing in order to get that miracle. But again, it wasn't them hastily just going and doing. They were told by God, they were told by Christ, do this, and they did it. Do this, and they did it. So it's in our obedience, it's in our action and our active obedience to him that brings about change and can work miracles in our lives. And when God does those things and works these miracles, we should respond in belief. We should respond in praise and worship, because that's what his disciples did. When they saw this, they believed. They saw his glory. They said, we believe, we believe. And they continued to follow him. And so that's the lesson for the water into wine. And thank you for watching this one. I hope there's a takeaway that you can share, maybe something interesting you learned about weddings or the wine and the transformation into new life that you can share with someone, and just help them to learn more about God. Help them to love God and see that God loves us, and all that Christ has done for us was out of love. So I hope that you can take one thing away and share it. Again, next lesson 28 is going to be talking about Jesus down in the temple and for the Passover, and it begins this the next portion of lessons, this next section in the book, that is the first full year of Jesus' ministry. So join me in that video. Thank you so much for watching this one, and I'll see you in that one.